Hey everybody, sorry I had to cancel class today. Didn't feel too well this morning, feeling a little better now. But I just want to be safe and not risk getting anybody sick. But I don't want to get behind in class, so we're doing policing now. Remember, we're all fully into the criminal justice system in this course, and so the plan is today we're going to go over more foundational elements of policing. So things like the historical evolution, the roles of police, things of that nature. So I'm going to use these YouTube videos to go over these basics. Now, when we start class on Thursday, before we get into police deviance and modern policing, we are going to actually review this from today. So don't worry if you're having issues. We'll start off class on Thursday. And I'll answer questions. We'll play a Kahoot, and we'll have some other activities to make sure we're up to speed before we move on to the second section of our policing course. Now, the first part of this is understanding the historical evolution of policing. And I don't expect you all in this class to know every little detail of this historical evolution. However, we are offering now a policing class in the spring and hope to continue to be offering that class where you'll dig fully into all this. But think of this class, since introductory class, as being more of a broad overview. Now, the first type of policing that existed, at least as far as we know, was called kin policing. And this is where you had, so this is 1750 BC, you had tribes or clans, but essentially they policed themselves. And they policed themselves either in their interest or police members of their tribe. And this was a very deadly form of policing. It led to a lot of blood feuds and blood feuds that lasted a long time because tribes, there was no central organizing piece of law that everybody was following, and there was not some policing unit that was an employee of the government that was there to enforce this law. This was rather, feuds among separate clans or factions who were trying to ensure that whatever their version of the law was upheld, and those who violated it were punished. Now, so you've seen the second bullet point. These are really the two first iterations of written law. If you take the incarceration class with me that I'll be teaching in the fall, we get into how that's set up a lot. That set up the modern idea of the rule of law. But both of these were written law, which was important. However, one of their key takeaways were they detailed how individuals should treat each other, but also, which matters for the policing part, what were the penalties if you violated that written law? Now, keep in mind, previously these blood feuds weren't relying on some kind of centralized, agreed upon rule of law. Now we're starting to see that. So if you have a centralized rule of law that everybody's agreed to and everybody's given up some of their freedom in order to abide by that law, remember that benefits you in two ways. One, even though you're giving up some freedom, you are trying to prevent yourself from being in constant blood feuds and constant warfare, right? This idea that the law will keep these separate factions, allow us to operate in a way that is free of bloodshed, but also we have to give up some of our freedom in order for that to occur. And by that I mean that now if you break this written law, you will be subject to punishment. You can't just use your form of policing that's owned by you to only enforce your idea of the law. This is more of a centralized, agreed upon rule of law among different factions. Now, in terms of the father of formal policing, the reason we call this Athenian ruler the father of formal policing is because this is where you start to see the first iterations of these kind of early city-states emerge in Greece. And the Athenians wanted to move away from these blood feuds, move away from the kin policing. They wanted some kind of centralized policing unit that would enforce the rule of law. And the first actual police force was developed by the Spartans in Athens. So this is about 27 BC, and Augustus Caesar was instrumental in their creation. And they were, you may see them if you've read in history books or if you take a history class, they refer to them as urban cohorts. And what they were men who were part of the larger army in Greece. They were charged with day in, day out ensuring the peace of the city. They also were charged with dealing with any time crime rose. Now, it's important to note that early on, these urban cohorts, they're kind of the first form of formal policing. However, when crime began to rise, Augustus actually formed these specific vigils that gave individuals the ability to arrest for the protection. Now, that's a big deal because now you're giving somebody the power of the government to take the freedom away of others, and this is the first time we really see that take form. Now, As we move into the Roman Empire had their form of a public police force, and they patrolled day and night. They had the ability to arrest and the ability to take somebody to incarceration, and the form of trials that existed at that time. Now, when the Roman Empire fell, what you kind of see is one, these various kings that existed in England, they were going to be appointed, they appointed sheriffs. And at this time, you're going to see these police forces that are run by these various kingdoms. However, typically who was operating as a police officer this time were 15-year-old boys. And they were given the power to go after people that were wanted for felonies. Now, clearly this is going to lead to a lot of corruption and drunkenness and other issues because you have a police force that are run not by professionals, but 15-year-old volunteers who are all 15-year-old boys. Now, this is also where you're going to see the wealthy individuals of the time, rather than relying on this police force to assume their protection and assume peace and order, they're just going to buy their own form of protection. And that was very common at that time. But this is where you see it evolving from the Greek Empire to the Roman Empire to now these various kings in England using their power to essentially give people the ability to arrest people that are for wanted felons, but also the wealthy beginning to take their safety into their own hands. Now, in terms of modern policing, the individual we care most about is Sir Robert Peel. And he's known as the father of modern policing because he's going to set up these Peelian principles, which are going to largely still guide the idea of policing and what police should be and how police should operate. Now, Sir Robert Peel coined the term bobbies, if you ever read that in any of the readings. And this is what he referred to as officers. He also began to look at policing and understanding the structure of policing. So what we mean by that is trying to understand how should police departments and police organizations be structured. Should they be this top-down approach? Who should have more power than others? Who should have the power to arrest versus who have the power to order? That's all going to be ideas that come from Peel, and Peel is actually going to help pass the Metropolitan Police Act in 1829, which created the first modern version of a British police force. And this police force that was developed, Sir Robert Peel is going to have a big hand in trying to come up, basically forming a guiding set of principles that are going to guide this police force, but also they were born out of various previous codes. So think of him as looking back through historical codes, historical iterations of policing, and kind of formulating these Peelian principles that would guide this modern British police force. Now, in terms of these 12 principles, I don't expect you to know all 12. However, what we're going to do in class on Thursday is I want you to look at these and I want you to think how many of these still apply today. I want you to also think of which of these things feel dated versus which of these have stood the test of time. So you can see that these 12 principles of policing, this is how Sir Robert Peel believed a police department and police force should operate. The first thing is the idea that police should be efficient, stable, and also organized along military lines. We'll talk on Thursday about how a lot of that still exists. Think about when you see police departments and you have sergeants and cadets and lieutenants, right? They very much are taking the idea of militarization and applying to policing, which is one of these Peelian principles. He's also going to argue that police must be under government control, meaning they're not run by wealthy individuals. Police are not run by some families. They are run by the government because their job is to enforce the law that is created by the government. This also is supposed to remove them so they're not just essentially personal protection, but their goal is to maintain order and peace among a city or a country. Now, he's also going to argue, number 3, that the way to see if police are efficient in doing their job is the absence of crime. This is the idea that he expects police to help prevent crime. He thinks that is possible. We'll have that debate in class, whether how much police are able to actually control crime versus how much is connected to other structural issues. However, he's going to make the argument that this is the best way to measure the efficacy of policing. He also is going to argue that crime news should be disseminating, meaning the citizenry should understand when is crime happening, where is it happening, and how are the police handling it. That should all be publicly available because, once again, police are employees of the government, which means they're employees of the citizens. And so he thinks all of this should be transparent. He also is going to argue that development of police strength by time and area is essential, meaning the ability to grow the legitimacy of the department is important. He's also going to talk about the individual officer. He's going to make the argument that the most important quality of an officer is somebody that can command their temper, quiet and determined, but somebody that's not going to be, highly aggressive or highly emotional. They're going to be calm and self-centered and be able to approach situations from more of an objective, rational perspective. He's also going to argue the physical appearance of police matters a lot. Think a la the modern police uniforms and how that can command respect. He's going to make that argument. Number 8, he argues that the root of efficiency in a police department is proper training. So he's going to push for the idea that if you're going to be a police officer, you should go through training. You should, once again, we're moving away from this idea of 15-year-old boys just volunteering to individuals that are professionals and are trained to do this job. Number 9, the idea that public security demands every officer be given a number. This is the idea that every officer has a unique identifier, and especially if they act in a way, they step over the line or act in a way that's devious or aggressive, that individual will be held accountable because they have been given this additional power that other citizens don't have. Number 10, police headquarters should be centrally located. This idea that because police work for the citizens and work for the government, they should be easy to locate and easy to access. Number 11, police should be hired on a probationary basis. This is the argument he makes that essentially as a police officer, you need to prove yourself that you are going to be somebody that can command their tempers, quiet, determined, and is morally sound before you're giving full-time contracts as a police officer. And then the last Pelian principle is that police records are necessary to correct the distribution of police strength. This is the idea that we should be recording police in terms of their actions, where they're being distributed, and also have somebody that can begin to evaluate policing and understand if it's meeting its goals and if it's effective or not. But once again, in Thursday's class, we'll start off with these 12 and kind of go through which ones we think still apply today versus which ones are a little less relevant in today's modern policing. Now, something else that we're going to do with this is policing has gone through various eras. And I remember when I took policing classes at the graduate school level, we looked at what we call paradigms of policing, meaning that during these various times in the modern era, you can see how police departments largely followed some kind of consistent theme or consistent guiding ideology and the way it shifts across time. Keep in mind that when you're looking at shifting paradigms, you're going to want to understand the way historical factors fuel that shift or shape that shift. And you'll kind of see that as we move through these eras. But the first era we're going to talk about is the political era. And so this is the first era of U.S. policing, but this is during the 1840s when the political era is dominating policing in the U.S. So there's a lot going on. First, you've got the Industrial Revolution. So you've got cities growing quickly, right? Cities are growing fast because there's industrial opportunities in cities like Chicago. Chicago's population is going to blow up during this time. So remember when we looked at Chicago School of Criminology, we also understood how the fast growing nature of the city also changed the complexion of Chicago and changed the nature of crime. And so that's going to matter. You're also going to see this time the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK are going to be extremely active in torturing freed slaves. And they largely operated unencumbered for many of their years in terms of they were for freed slaves. They were mass lynching freed slaves. They were killing freed slaves. They were wiping out things like Black Wall Street and Black wealth. And so all this is going on with little encumbered. Even when the police, the modern U.S. police departments began to formulate, they made little effort to try to intervene in the KKK, and some of them were active members of the KKK. In fact, we're going to talk about on Thursday how policing in the U.S. actually started more as a goal to try to take freed slaves and arrest them for minor offenses and then lease them in a convict leasing system. So basically taking what are now freed slaves, but because they're arrested for being a quote-unquote criminal, they then are going to be used for cheap, if not free labor, for all of the plantations that had lost that free labor when slavery was abolished at the end of the Civil War. Now, this is also called the political era because policing was under control of politicians. So it had a lot of influence in terms of the politicians, what their perspective was, or how they wanted to see police operate. We're also going to see very few black police officers being hired until the 1950s. And really not until the Civil Rights era do we begin to see police departments begin to diversify a little bit. So nearly all police officers were white men. Many of them were directly connected to the KKK, if not a part of the KKK. And so you're going to see a police force in the U.S. that is going to operate, one, in a way that's going to be extremely discriminatory, but also going to be more responsive to the needs of white citizens versus black citizens. And we're going to talk on Thursday how much of that continued even into the civil rights era. So that's going to be the first video for today. I'm going to go and pause this, I'm going to post it, and then I'll start a second video with the other notes for today. All right, I'll see you all soon.